The House chamber hummed with tension as Speaker Mike Johnson approached the podium, his face set with unusual determination. The C-SPAN camera zoomed in as he straightened his tie and surveyed the assembled representatives with the practiced authority of his office. "Before we proceed with today's scheduled business," Johnson began, his Louisiana accent more pronounced than usual, "I feel compelled to address statements made yesterday by the gentlewoman from Texas regarding our judiciary nomination process." An unexpected hush fell over the normally bustling chamber. Representatives from both parties looked up from their devices and conversations. Sensing this was no routine procedural announcement, Johnson rarely used the Speaker's podium for anything beyond formal business, making this direct confrontation all the more shocking. Representative Crockett's comments yesterday not only displayed a fundamental misunderstanding of our constitutional duties, Johnson continued, his voice hardening as his gaze fixed on Jasmine Crockett seated across the chamber, but reflected a concerning pattern of inflammatory rhetoric that has become a trademark of her brief tenure in this body. Murmurs spread through the chamber as Johnson took the extraordinary step of using the Speaker's position, traditionally maintained as a role above partisan attacks, to directly criticize a specific member. "I've reviewed the gentlewoman's record both in Congress and before," Johnson pressed on, his tone growing increasingly dismissive. "And I must say, I find it troubling that someone whose legal career consisted primarily of defending criminals in Texas courtrooms now presumes to lecture this body on constitutional interpretation." Gasps echoed throughout the chamber. Johnson had crossed an unwritten line by personally attacking a member's professional background from the Speaker's podium, a position meant to maintain decorum rather than launch partisan attacks. "The American people deserve representatives who understand the gravity of their office and the constitutional principles that govern it," Johnson declared, his voice rising. "Not social media personalities seeking viral moments through divisive rhetoric." The unprecedented attack hung in the air as cameras panned to Jasmine Crockett. The 42-year-old freshman congresswoman from Texas's 30th District sat perfectly still, her expression unreadable as she absorbed Johnson's blistering critique. Several senior Democrats leaned toward her, whispering urgently, but she gently waved them off. Without breaking eye contact with the Speaker, Crockett calmly pressed the button, requesting speaking time. The chamber grew silent as her name appeared on the request queue. Johnson, noticing this, looked momentarily taken aback but nodded in acknowledgement. "The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas for 1 minute," Johnson announced, the formal language of congressional procedure, contrasting sharply with the personal attack he had just delivered. Crockett rose from her seat with deliberate composure, smoothing her blazer as she approached the microphone. The chamber fell completely silent as members from both parties leaned forward, sensing a watershed moment in the making. "Mr. Speaker," she began, her voice steady and controlled, "I thank you for the opportunity to respond to your characterization of both my professional background and my comments regarding our constitutional duties." She paused briefly, making direct eye contact with Johnson across the chamber. "And I promise you, sir, the next 30 seconds will demonstrate precisely which one of us truly understands the Constitution we both swore to protect." The digital clock began counting down her allocated minute as the chamber held its collective breath. What happened next would send shockwaves through Washington and transform the political landscape in ways no one could have anticipated. Mike Johnson's path to the Speaker's chair had been as unlikely as it was swift. After the chaotic removal of Kevin McCarthy and the failed nominations of several more senior Republicans, Johnson, a relatively low-profile conservative from Louisiana's 4th District, had emerged as the compromised candidate capable of uniting the fractured Republican conference. At 51, his elevation from backbencher to third in line for the presidency had been unexpected, even to Johnson himself. Before entering Congress in 2017, Johnson had built his reputation as a constitutional attorney with the Alliance Defending Freedom, a conservative Christian legal advocacy organization. His legal career had focused primarily on religious liberty cases in state courts, and he frequently cited this background as evidence of his deep understanding of constitutional principles. "I've spent my professional life studying and defending the Constitution," he often reminded colleagues and constituents. Since assuming the Speaker's gavel, Johnson had walked a precarious political tightrope, attempting to satisfy his conference's conservative members while managing a razor-thin majority that required near-perfect unity on every vote. Recent weeks had been particularly challenging as contentious Supreme Court confirmation hearings dominated Washington's attention. Johnson had staked significant political capital on opposing the nomination, framing Republican opposition as a constitutional duty to prevent judicial activism. The previous day, during a Judiciary Committee hearing, Congresswoman Crockett had delivered a pointed critique of this framing, suggesting it represented a selective and politically convenient reading of constitutional advice and consent powers. Her comments, which included direct references to Johnson's contradictory statements about judicial nominees during the prior administration, had quickly gone viral on social media and been featured on several news networks. For Johnson, the personal challenge to his constitutional expertise, his primary claim to authority within his conference, demanded a response. With pressure from his right flank to demonstrate strength and a growing narrative that he had been outmaneuvered on procedural matters, Johnson had made the extraordinary decision to directly confront Crockett from the Speaker's podium. Across the chamber sat Jasmine Crockett, observing Johnson with the measured patience of a trial attorney who had faced far more intimidating opponents in high-stakes courtrooms. Her path to Capitol Hill represented a new generation of lawmakers who had come to Washington not through traditional political channels, but through activism and direct advocacy work. After earning her law degree from the University of Houston, Crockett had built a reputation as one of Dallas's most effective civil rights attorneys. Her practice had focused on police misconduct cases, voting rights litigation, and criminal defense work that had often placed her in direct opposition to powerful institutions. Her most notable achievements included securing the exoneration of 3 wrongfully convicted men who had spent a combined 52 years in prison for crimes they didn't commit, cases that exposed serious protocol misconduct and led to significant reforms in the Texas criminal justice system. After serving in the Texas House of Representatives, where she gained national attention for her outspoken defense of voting rights during contentious election legislation debates, Crockett had won election to Congress in 2022. At 42, she brought to Washington both significant constitutional litigation experience and the direct, unfiltered approach of someone accustomed to fighting uphill battles against entrenched power. "I didn't come to Congress to make friends or play politics as usual," she had told supporters during her campaign. "I came to speak truth to power and to fight for people who have been left out of the conversation for too long." For Crockett, Johnson's attack wasn't merely personal. It represented a fundamental mischaracterization of constitutional principles that had guided her entire legal career. Having spent years litigating constitutional claims in federal courts, including a voting rights case that reached the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, she viewed Johnson's claim to superior constitutional understanding as not just professionally insulting, but factually incorrect. The stakes of this confrontation extended far beyond the two individuals at its center. For Republicans, Johnson's speakership itself rested on his authority and respect within the chamber. For Democrats, Crockett represented a new generation of leadership unafraid to directly challenge power structures with substantive expertise rather than procedural deference. For the American public, many of whom were watching the unusual direct confrontation live on C-SPAN, the exchange raised fundamental questions about credentials, expertise, and who gets to claim constitutional authority in our national debates. The House chamber was filled beyond capacity with members who had been working in their offices, streaming in as word spread of the unprecedented confrontation between the Speaker and the freshman representative. Senior party leaders from both sides were now paying rapt attention, recognizing that this exchange could reshape power dynamics within the institution. As Crockett stood at the microphone, her allocated minute already ticking down, the contrast between the two figures could not have been more stark. Johnson, the unexpected speaker wielding institutional power from the elevated podium, had just taken the extraordinary step of using that position to personally attack a junior member's professional qualifications. Crockett, the freshman representative with a fraction of Johnson's institutional authority, but significantly more constitutional litigation experience, now had precisely 60 seconds to respond to his dismissal of her entire legal career and constitutional understanding. What Johnson had not anticipated was that in challenging Crockett's legal background and constitutional expertise, he had unwittingly wandered into precisely the territory where she was most formidable, and where his own record contained vulnerabilities that she, with a prosecutor's instinct for effective cross-examination, had thoroughly researched and was fully prepared to expose. "Mr. Speaker," Crockett began, her voice clear and measured as she addressed Johnson directly, "since you've questioned my understanding of constitutional principles and my legal background, I believe some clarification is necessary for the benefit of this body and the American people." She stood confidently at the microphone, maintaining direct eye contact with Johnson across the chamber. "You characterize my legal career as primarily defending criminals in Texas courtrooms. For the record, while I am proud of my work as a criminal defense attorney, ensuring constitutional rights for all Americans, a fundamental principle of our legal system, the majority of my legal career was actually spent as a civil rights attorney." Crockett's tone remained professional, but a new intensity entered her voice. "I successfully litigated voting rights cases that protected access to the ballot for thousands of citizens. I won police misconduct cases that held power accountable and changed departmental policies across multiple jurisdictions. And yes, I represented defendants whose constitutional rights were being violated, including 3 men who were ultimately exonerated after collectively spending more than 50 years in prison for crimes they did not commit." The chamber had fallen completely silent, members on both sides watching the exchange with rapt attention. Johnson maintained a neutral expression, though his posture had stiffened noticeably as Crockett methodically corrected his characterization of her professional background. "You suggested my understanding of the Constitution is somehow inadequate for this body," Crockett continued. "So perhaps this is an appropriate moment to compare our constitutional records." She glanced down at notes she had quickly jotted during Johnson's attack, then looked back up directly at the speaker. "In 2020, you stated that the president has virtually unlimited authority in matters of foreign affairs, a position rejected by the Supreme Court in multiple cases from Youngstown Steel to Zavodsky, which established clear limits on executive power." Murmurs spread through the chamber as several constitutional law experts among the membership recognized the reference to landmark Supreme Court decisions. Johnson shifted in his chair as Crockett continued her methodical examination. "In your amicus brief in Texas versus Pennsylvania, you argued one state could sue to invalidate another state's election procedures, a position so fundamentally contrary to basic constitutional federalism that it was rejected unanimously by the Supreme Court, including all 3 justices appointed by the president you were defending." Gasps echoed through the chamber. By directly addressing Johnson's involvement in post-election litigation, Crockett had touched on one of the most sensitive aspects of the speaker's record, one rarely mentioned in official proceedings. "You advocated a constitutional theory so flawed that not a single justice, regardless of who appointed them, found it persuasive," Crockett continued, her voice gaining strength. "Is that the constitutional expertise you're suggesting I lack, Mr. Speaker?" The atmosphere in the chamber had transformed completely. What had begun as a unilateral attack by the speaker had evolved into a point-by-point constitutional examination that was clearly catching Johnson off guard. Several senior Republicans were now urgently signaling to the parliamentary staff, likely seeking procedural means to end the unexpected cross-examination of their speaker. "You claimed I've mischaracterized our constitutional duties regarding judicial nominations," Crockett said, referencing Johnson's earlier attack. "Yet, in 2016, you stated that the Senate has no constitutional obligation to consider a Supreme Court nominee in an election year. In 2020, you claimed it had a constitutional duty to do so." She paused briefly, allowing the contradiction to sink in. "Those positions cannot both be constitutionally correct. Mr. Speaker, the Constitution doesn't change based on which party controls the Senate or White House." The digital clock showed she had used 40 seconds of her allocated minute. As she prepared to deliver her final point, the chamber held its collective breath. Johnson, visibly uncomfortable now, appeared to be weighing whether to use his gavel to cut her off. a move that would only reinforce her point about selective constitutional interpretation but might prevent further damage. Before he could decide, Crockett delivered her most devastating point yet. "Mr. Speaker, you questioned my understanding of the Constitution. But, as someone who has actually litigated and won constitutional cases in federal courts on behalf of Americans whose rights were being denied, I must ask, how many constitutional cases have you personally litigated and won in federal court?" The question hung in the air like a thunderclap. Every member in the chamber knew the answer. Despite Johnson's frequent references to his constitutional expertise, his litigation experience had been primarily in state courts on narrow religious liberty questions rather than in federal courts on broader constitutional matters. Crockett, on the other hand, had built her career on federal constitutional litigation, a fact well known to her colleagues but rarely mentioned by Crockett herself until directly challenged. The 10-second warning light flashed on Crockett's microphone, signaling her time was nearly expired. She had saved her most powerful point for these final seconds. "Mr. Speaker," Crockett said, her voice now resonating with moral clarity that commanded the chamber's complete attention. "There's a profound difference between citing the Constitution and actually defending it in courtrooms on behalf of Americans whose rights are being denied." She paused briefly, allowing the tension to build as the chamber remained utterly silent. "While you've used the Constitution as a rhetorical device to advance a political agenda, I've used it as a shield to protect voting rights, due process, and equal protection for citizens who were being denied their constitutional birthright." Stunned silence filled the chamber. With a single sentence, Crockett had not only defended her record, but had reframed the entire exchange as a contrast between theoretical constitutional rhetoric and practical constitutional advocacy. "My understanding of our founding document comes not from selective citation, but from standing beside Americans whose constitutional rights were being actively violated. Black voters systematically purged from rolls. Defendants denied fair trials. Citizens subjected to excessive force by the state. The power dynamic in the chamber had completely reversed. Despite Johnson's elevated position at the speaker's podium, all eyes were now fixed on Crockett. Her command of constitutional principle and her authentic experience as a constitutional advocate had transformed her from target to authority in less than 1 minute. "You referenced my background in criminal defense as though it diminishes my constitutional understanding," Crockett continued, her voice steady but intensifying. "Those defendants were Americans presumed innocent under our Constitution, including 3 men I helped exonerate after they spent decades in prison for crimes they didn't commit because their constitutional rights were violated." Johnson appeared frozen, clearly recognizing that any attempt to cut her off would only validate her point about selective constitutional application. Democratic members were now sitting forward in their seats, witnessing what many would later describe as a defining moment in modern congressional history. "The Constitution isn't just words we memorize, Mr. Speaker. It's promises we keep. Promises that power will be checked, rights will be protected, and justice will be accessible to all, not just those who look like you or share your theological perspectives." Crockett's time was nearly expired, but she delivered her final point with the precision of a constitutional litigator and the moral force of someone who had fought in the trenches of America's ongoing struggle to fulfill its founding promises. "So, yes, Mr. Speaker, let's examine our constitutional records. Let's compare who has actually stood in federal courtrooms defending constitutional rights versus who has simply claimed constitutional expertise while advancing theories rejected by every level of our judiciary. Because the difference between us isn't that you understand the Constitution better. It's that I've actually used it to deliver justice for Americans whose constitutional rights were being denied by people sharing your selective interpretation of our founding document." The 1-minute warning light on her microphone flashed red. Crockett nodded in acknowledgement. "You questioned my qualifications from that podium, but with respect, Mr. Speaker, perhaps instead of questioning my constitutional understanding, you should reflect on the unanimous rejection of your own constitutional theories by our nation's highest court." I yield back. As Crockett returned to her seat, The Democratic side of the chamber erupted in a standing ovation, an extraordinary breach of decorum that reflected the unprecedented nature of both Johnson's attack and Crockett's response. Several moderate Republicans remained conspicuously seated with thoughtful expressions, while others looked visibly uncomfortable with what they had just witnessed. Johnson, still at the podium, appeared momentarily paralyzed by the unexpected constitutional challenge to his authority. His face had drained of color, and aides were now urgently approaching with notes, likely suggested procedural paths forward or talking points to regain control of the narrative. But the damage was already done. In just 30 seconds of substantive response to his attack, Jasmine Crockett had not only defended her constitutional credentials, but had raised profound questions about Johnson's own understanding and application of constitutional principles, all while elevating the exchange from a personal attack to a meaningful debate about constitutional interpretation that resonated far beyond the chamber walls. What had begun as Johnson's attempt to publicly diminish a junior member had transformed into a defining moment in his speakership. Broadcast live to millions of Americans who could now judge for themselves which of the two lawmakers demonstrated deeper constitutional understanding. Within minutes of the exchange, clips began circulating across every major social media platform. The hashtag Constitutional Clapback shot to #1 trending worldwide with the video of Crockett's methodical dismantling of Johnson's constitutional credentials reaching 30 million views by evening. A split-screen meme comparing Johnson's confident attack to his stunned expression 1 minute later went viral with the caption, "When you bring a speech to a constitutional fight." Major networks scrambled to adjust their programming with special reports breaking into regular broadcasts. Unprecedented clash. Speaker Johnson attacks Rep. Crockett gets constitutional lesson in response. CNN's Chiron read, "Speaker questions Congresswoman's legal background." She responds with constitutional masterclass. Even Fox News ran with the headline, "Dramatic confrontation on House floor raises questions about Speaker's authority." Constitutional law professors and former federal judges were quickly booked for panel discussions across networks. "What we witnessed today wasn't just a political moment," explained a Harvard law professor on MSNBC. "It was the difference between someone who talks about the Constitution in abstract terms and someone who has actually litigated to protect constitutional rights in practice." The contrast couldn't have been more stark. The clip of Crockett asking how many federal constitutional cases Johnson had personally litigated became an instant, classic moment in congressional history with law professors across the country immediately indicating they would incorporate it into their courses on constitutional advocacy. Outside the Capitol, reporters swarmed as members exited the chamber. When Crockett eventually emerged, surrounded by Democratic colleagues, the shouted questions came from every direction. Completely. "Congresswoman, did you anticipate Speaker Johnson would attack your credentials? Were you prepared for that constitutional comparison? Will you be pursuing a formal censure of the Speaker for his unprecedented use of the podium?" Crockett paused briefly, composed despite the chaos around her. Today's exchange was unfortunate but necessary. When the Speaker of the House uses his position to personally attack a member's professional background and constitutional understanding, it demands a substantive response. "I would have preferred to debate these important constitutional questions in a more appropriate forum, but I will always defend both my record and my understanding of our founding document when directly challenged." With that statement, she continued walking, leaving reporters scrambling to file their stories. Meanwhile, Johnson had canceled his scheduled press availability with his communications director citing scheduling conflicts, an excuse that fooled no one given the day's dramatic events. Back in the Capitol, the political shockwaves were already reshaping power dynamics within both parties. Senior Democrats who had previously viewed Crockett primarily as a progressive voice with limited institutional influence were now reassessing her as a constitutional authority with exceptional skills in both preparation and delivery. What Representative Crockett demonstrated today wasn't just impressive rhetoric. It was masterful constitutional analysis delivered under extraordinary pressure. The House Democratic leader told reporters she responded to a personal attack with substance, evidence, and principle. That's exactly the kind of leadership our caucus values. Among Republicans, private assessments acknowledge the devastating effectiveness of Crockett's response and the tactical error of Johnson's attack. He picked the wrong member to challenge on constitutional grounds. A veteran Republican congressman was overheard telling a colleague, "Everyone knows she actually litigated these issues. It's like challenging Steph Curry to a three-point contest." More concerning for Johnson's speakership were the conversations happening in small groups of Republican members. Throughout the Capitol, several moderate Republicans expressed private dismay at the Speaker's unprecedented use of his position for a personal attack, while members of the Hardline Freedom Caucus were openly questioning whether Johnson truly possessed the constitutional expertise he had claimed during the Speaker's race. By evening, the pressure had mounted to the point that Johnson issued a written statement. "While I stand by my concerns about rhetoric that undermines our institutions, I regret that today's exchange diverted attention from the important work before Congress. I have reached out to Representative Crockett to discuss how we can move forward in a productive manner." The carefully worded non-apology satisfied no one and only fueled more coverage of the original exchange. Constitutional law experts continued, dissecting the substantive points raised in Crockett's response, with many noting that her characterization of Johnson's amicus brief in Texas versus Pennsylvania was factually accurate and revealing about his approach to constitutional interpretation. For Crockett, the moment marked a transformation in her national profile. Interview requests flooded her office from outlets that had previously shown little interest in a freshman representative. Legal journals requested articles on her constitutional perspective. Law schools invited her to deliver lectures on constitutional advocacy. What happened on the House floor wasn't just about one exchange or one speaker, Crockett explained in her first in-depth interview following the incident. It was about challenging the notion that only certain people with certain backgrounds get to claim authority over our Constitution. That document belongs to all Americans, not just those who use it selectively to advance a particular ideology. The professional consequences for Johnson continued to mount in the weeks following the confrontation. His approval ratings among Republican voters dropped significantly, with many citing concerns about his judgment and his understanding of the Speaker's role. More damaging were the whispers within his conference about whether he truly possessed the constitutional expertise that had been a central pillar of his speakership campaign. Most significantly, Johnson's ability to manage floor debates on constitutional issues from judicial nominations to executive power was permanently compromised. Democratic members began regularly referencing the exchange when challenging his procedural rulings, and even Republican members became more willing to publicly question his constitutional interpretation. 3 months after the confrontation, when another contentious constitutional question came before the House, Johnson took the extraordinary step of yielding the gavel to a deputy before participating in the debate, a tacit acknowledgement that his authority on constitutional matters had been fundamentally undermined by the exchange with Crockett. For congressional veterans and constitutional scholars, the Crockett response represented a rare moment when substantive expertise triumphed over institutional authority in congressional debate. What Representative Crockett demonstrated, wrote a professor of constitutional law in the Yale Law Journal, was that meaningful constitutional discourse requires more than citation of credentials. It demands a coherent understanding of constitutional principles and their practical application in American life. The broader lesson for Washington insiders was clear. Underestimate Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett at your peril. The freshman representative from Texas had transformed herself. From a new face in Congress to a constitutional authority with national influence, and in doing so had permanently altered the perception of who gets to claim constitutional expertise in our national debates. As one senior congressional aide told the Washington Post in a retrospective piece, before that exchange, certain members could claim constitutional authority based primarily on their background or ideology. Now there's a higher standard. You better be prepared to defend your constitutional interpretation on its merits, because someone like Crockett might just expose the gaps in your understanding for the whole country to see. For everyday Americans watching the political drama unfold, the 30-second constitutional lesson provided something increasingly rare in public discourse: A moment of clarity where substantive knowledge triumphed over procedural authority, where lived experience with constitutional principles proved more valuable than abstract rhetoric about them, and where the fundamental question of who the Constitution protects was placed at the center of our national conversation. The lesson was unmistakable for anyone paying attention. In America's ongoing constitutional dialogue, it's not about who has the most impressive title, the longest tenure, or the most institutional power. It's about who can most effectively articulate how our founding principles apply to the lived reality of all Americans, not just those who have traditionally held power. Subscribe for more political takedowns. That jaw-dropping moment when Jasmine Crockett systematically exposed Speaker Johnson's constitutional misunderstandings shows exactly why genuine expertise defeats positional authority every single time. Did you see how quickly his confident attack transformed into stunned silence when faced with her actual constitutional record? If you enjoyed this detailed breakdown of real congressional accountability in action, don't forget to subscribe to our channel right now. We deliver the most dramatic political confrontations with in-depth analysis you won't find anywhere else. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our upcoming videos. Top 10 Constitutional Clashes in Congress and Speakers Get Schooled. Historic House Floor Moments. The Art of Constitutional Response. How to defend your expertise. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below and share your thoughts on this historic takedown. Was this the most satisfying congressional moment you've seen this year? Remember to like this video and share it with friends who appreciate seeing substantive knowledge triumph over political posturing. The more views we get, the more content like this we can create. See you in the next explosive political showdown.